In 1945, Tokyo lost more lives in a single night of firebombing than Hiroshima. Nearly half of Japan's cities were reduced to ash. Industrial output collapsed to a tenth of what it was. 80 million people faced starvation. America's answer was a constitution that banned all armed forces, seemingly locking Japan's fate. So how did this devastated country end up with one of the world's largest militaries, funding tanks and aircraft it was not allowed to have? The secret is hidden in the hunger, the rescue, and the uneasy promises that came right after the ashes. Tokyo in the summer of 1945 was a graveyard of twisted steel and blackened stone. The firebombing of March 9th and 10th killed more than 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb. 60% of the city lay in ruins. Across Japan, 40% of targeted cities were flattened, entire neighborhoods erased from the map. The war left over 2 million dead, both soldiers and civilians. Factories that once churned out tanks and aircraft stood silent, their roofs collapsed, machines melted by incendiaries. By August 1945, industrial production had fallen to just 10% of pre-war levels. General Douglas MacArthur, stepping onto Japanese soil as Supreme Commander, described a nation of 80 million starving and demoralized, warning that it would take a generation for Japan to recover. In the shadows of gutted buildings, families scavenged for scraps, and a city that once bustled with life was reduced to silence and hunger. Survival in post-war Japan depended on outside help. Daily food rations for adults dropped to just over 1,000 calories, barely 2/3 of what a healthy person needs. In Tokyo, the situation was even worse. For half of 1946, residents received only 775 calories a day. The city's population shrank by nearly half as people fled in search of food. American occupation authorities, faced with the threat of mass starvation, shipped in enormous quantities of wheat, powdered milk, and canned goods. Relief ledgers show that in 1946 alone, United States aid kept as many as 20 million Japanese alive each month. Over the next 7 years, American programs delivered $2.2 billion in food and supplies, about $18 billion today, enough to fill the gap left by a ruined harvest and a shattered economy. These shipments were not just charity. They gave the United States powerful leverage over Japan's recovery, setting the terms for every ton of grain and every barrel of oil that entered the country. For millions, American aid was the difference between life and death. In early February 1946, a small team of legal officers inside General MacArthur's headquarters worked around the clock. Within just 6 days, they produced a draft for Japan's new constitution, an unprecedented pace for such a sweeping document. At its heart lay Article 9, a clause that would reshape the nation's future. The text was clear, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. With these words, Japan's right to maintain military forces was erased. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers issued a disbandment order, dissolving the Imperial Army and Navy. On May 3rd, 1947, the new constitution took effect, locking Japan into a pacifist frame that would define its post-war identity. The legal architects behind Article 9 believed they were building a permanent safeguard against militarism, but their sweeping ban would soon face tests they could not have predicted. By late 1947, the American occupation strategy took a sharp turn. The threat of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and the looming victory of Mao's forces in China sent shockwaves through Washington, and policy shifted toward rebuilding Japan as an ally. The original plan to break up 325 of Japan's largest conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, was quietly shelved. Only 11 companies were actually dissolved, leaving industrial giants like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo largely intact. In the corridors of power, conservative politicians and former business leaders who had been purged for their wartime roles began to return. Occupation authorities, once focused on rooting out militarism, now worried more about communist influence. The change was a clear reversal in priorities. The so-called Red Purge of 1950 swept through government offices and factories, removing around 20,000 left-leaning officials, teachers, and union organizers. Secret occupation memos from this period reveal a new priority: to stabilize Japan as a bulwark against communism, even if it meant reversing earlier reforms. The result was a country with restored industrial capacity, a conservative political class, and a constitution that still banned any military. On paper, Japan remained defenseless. In reality, Already, the groundwork was being laid for a rapid response to the next crisis, one that would demand more than words and legal promises. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel, and the world's attention snapped to the Korean peninsula. For Japan, the shock was immediate. The U.S. 24th Infantry Division, stationed on Japanese soil, shipped out for Korea within days, leaving the islands exposed. General MacArthur, still Supreme Commander, moved quickly. He ordered Prime Minister Yoshida to create a national police reserve of 75,000 men. On paper, it was a police force, but in practice, it was the first armed unit Japan had fielded since surrender. To avoid violating Article 9, the new force's tanks were officially labeled special vehicles, and recruits wore police uniforms, not military fatigues. Internal memos from MacArthur's headquarters revealed the legal gymnastics. Rifles and armored cars became tools for internal security, not war. The order for rearmament arrived like a lifeline for Japanese industry. Nowhere was the impact more dramatic than at Toyota. In June 1950, the company teetered on the edge of collapse, producing only 300 trucks a month and struggling to pay workers. By July 1950, Toyota received a US order for 1,000 trucks to supply the Korean front. Production lines roared back to life. Within a year, Toyota was turning out over 2,000 vehicles each month. Wages doubled, and the company paid its first dividend since the war's end. For many on the factory floor, the war in Korea meant not just survival, but a second chance. A starving nation, forbidden to build an army, was suddenly funding its own armed force. One contract and one special vehicle at a time. Subscribe for more stories that unravel the hidden mechanics behind global power shifts. Nearly 3,000 Japanese companies, from steel giants to textile mills, signed contracts to supply the American war effort. United States procurement offices funneled $800 million a year into Japanese factories, money that paid for trucks, uniforms, radios, and steel. In 1951, these special orders accounted for a quarter of all Japanese exports. By 1952, the share climbed to 35%. Over 4 years, the total surpassed $3 billion, and infusion that powered 2 decades of 10% annual growth. Bank of Japan Governor Ichimata called the windfall divine aid. Prime Minister Yoshida, in private, called the Korean War a grace of heaven. Ambassador Robert Murphy described the transformation in blunt terms. Japan had become one huge supply depot. The same contracts that revived Toyota and kept the lights on in Osaka rebuilt the industrial base for a nation that, on paper, was forbidden to rearm. Money and machines flowed in, and with them the means to fund a new force, no matter what the Constitution said. The National Police Reserve became the National Safety Force in 1952, and just 2 years later, Japan's lawmakers gave it a new name, the Self-Defense Forces. Today, this institution counts 250,000 personnel, one of the largest standing forces outside the United States, China, and Russia. Japan's annual defense budget has soared to $55 billion, placing it among the world's top 10 military spenders. The Self-Defense Forces now operate aircraft carriers in all but name 2 Izumo-class ships, each being refitted to carry F-35B stealth fighters. By 2027, Japan will field 147 F-35s and deploy 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles, the first true long-range strike weapons in its arsenal since 1945. In 2022, the government approved a plan to double defense spending to 2% of gross domestic product, a level not seen since the war. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's 2014 cabinet decision allowed Japan to defend its allies, stretching Article 9 to new limits without ever changing a single word of the Constitution. Today, Japan's military exists in a paradox, prohibited by its own constitution, yet funded to rival global powers. As security threats rise in Asia, every constitutional word is tested anew. The line between defense and rearmament is not just legal, it is the frontier of Japan's future. What do you think?